Have you ever wanted to make awesome boss fights in Fortnite, but didn't know how? Well, you're in luck because in this video, I'm going to be covering everything from making the custom health bar to making cool attacks. Speaking of different attacks, we just released a new update to our Creator Success program that added built-in attacks to our simulator system, along with a bunch of other incredible features. So, if you want to make truly next level maps, this is the best way to do so. With the Creator Success program, you don't just get the simulator system, you get access to our entire content library with tons of other useful scripts and systems. You also get full guides to walk you through setting it up, along with support on any issues you encounter. And that's just touching the iceberg of everything. So if you want to take your maps to the next level while saving time and money in the process, then check out the Creator Success program. It'll be the first link in the description below. Anyways, let's get back to the video. So when making a boss fight, the first thing that you need is the actual boss. You're going to need to import your own mesh that you can find on the internet, or you can create your own. And you'll probably want some different attack animations as well as a walking animation. And you'll want it to be a skeletal mesh so that you can have these animations with it. But once you've done this, we now actually need to make the blueprint that we're planning to use. So we'll go ahead and right click and hit blueprint class and create a building prop. I'm just going to call this my golem BP for blueprint prop and then open it up. Inside of this, the first thing we want to do is add a skeletal mesh, which will be our golem. So go ahead and select our golem mesh as the skeletal mesh asset. And then for this, we can just go ahead and play our idle animation so that it'll play whenever there's no other animations playing. But the issue with this is that skeletal meshes are not going to have collision, even if we do change this from no collision. So we're going to have to make our own custom collision components. And to do that, I'm going to add a cube and make sure this is underneath your skeletal mesh. If it's not, you want to move it underneath it. And then you just want to position this to act as the collision. So I'll go ahead and scale and move this so that it aligns with each of the different body parts. So I'll start off here with the foot. Then I'll go ahead and copy it and do it again for the other foot. So you want to continue this process for all of the different body parts that you want to be able to be hit. You don't need to be super specific on body parts that aren't going to be interacting with players because you don't need to worry about their collision being messed up. So for example, the upper body, you can make a lot larger and just cover more area with it, like so. Obviously, the more specific you are, then the better the actual hitbox is going to be. But once you went ahead and created all the different cubes that you want for collision, you can go ahead and select them all and then turn off their visibility like so. And you also want to enable hidden in game so that they're not shown. Then you can go ahead and compile and save. And we have our blueprint, which we can now use and place down. So this is a little too small of a golem, so I'm going to make sure to scale it up a bit to be the size I want for my boss. We're then going to go ahead and create a custom health bar for this boss. So to do that, we're going to use Verse. So I'll hit Verse and open up the Verse Explorer. In here, I'm going to right click on my project file to add a new Verse file. And I'll name this our boss manager and hit create. Go ahead and hit save selected. And then whenever this loads, I'll open it up. So in this, the first thing we need to do is go ahead and create a way for the boss fight to actually start. So I'll have this boss start on a timer. So I'll make an editable and I'll call this our timer or our boss timer. And it's going to be of type timer device. And we'll just initialize it with the timer device. Then we'll start this boss timer at the start of the game, like so. And whenever this boss timer completes, so we'll do boss timer dot success event dot subscribe, and we'll call a new function called start boss fight. Now let's get on here and actually create this start boss fight function, like so. And I'm just going to put a block for now. Here we get an error, and that's because a timer success event is going to return a optional agent. So that's what we need to receive. So I'll create a maybe agent of type optional agent, like so. Because this timer, we want it to display for all players and not just one, then this is not actually going to return any player, so we're not going to use this. Instead, what we want to do is see if the player is within the boss fight arena, the boss fight zone. So to do that, we'll need to use a mutator zone. So I'll make an editable mutator, and I'll call this a mutator zone device, which I'll initialize with itself like so. And then what we'll do is whenever the boss fight starts, we'll go through every single player in the play space by writing this right here. And then for every single player, we're going to check if the player is inside of this mutator, and you do it by using this is in zone right here. Oh, but I have an error here. So if we actually look in the mutator zone device, it is called is in volume, not is in zone. So I'll just replace that. So whenever the boss fight starts, it's going to go through all of the players and check if they're in the volume. And if they are, what do we want to do? Well, we want to save these players somewhere. So what we'll do is actually, whenever the boss fight starts, before we go through every player, we'll make an array of players that are actually in the zone. So I'll make a variable, and I'll call this players in fight, and I'll make it an array of player and initialize it with an empty array. So that now, whenever we go through every player and check if they're in the boss fight zone, then if they are, we will set our players in fight array plus equal to an array with our player in it. And this will just add the player to this array. So now under here, after we've went ahead and gotten all of the players that are going to actually be in this boss fight, we now need to do a couple things for them. First, we need to apply the health bar to them. So let's do that. And to do the custom health bar, I'm actually going to take a little shortcut and use some code that I created in an earlier tutorial for how to make custom health for players. But we're just going to repurpose that. So I went ahead and opened that file up, and I'm going to copy all of that and then throw it in down here. Make sure that everything is aligned so that we don't get any errors. And we're missing a couple things here. We need to include these libraries. So I'll just go ahead, copy these and add them to the top of our file. So I went ahead and did that. Also, if you didn't use that tutorial, don't worry. You can find all of the code from that tutorial, as well as all of the code that we make in this tutorial in our Discord, which will be linked below. And you can get it all for completely free. Okay, so now that we have all of this code, we actually need to figure out a way to make it work for the boss's HP rather than the player's HP. So first, let's go ahead and actually add it to all of our players in the fight. So I'll go through every single player in our players in fight, not in the play space, and we will call this initiate function here for our player. And this will go ahead and add the health bar, but let's go ahead and make some changes. First off, we only need one bar, because I'm not planning on our boss having any shield. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all of this, which we just don't need. Go ahead and remove this as well, like so. So now that all of those areas are cleaned up with us removing the shield, we also want to go ahead and reposition this so that it doesn't replace the player's health. So to do that, I'm going to minimize verse, and I'll go to my content browser and create a new widget blueprint, user widget, and I'll name this our boss health bar, like so. Then open it up, drag a canvas panel onto the screen to represent the player screen, then drag an image. Go ahead and anchor it to the top, like so. I'll change the alignment to center it as well. Now I'm going to go ahead and position this where I want, and I want it to take a lot of my screen. So I'll go ahead and set it up like so. Go ahead and fix up these values to get them exactly where I'd like. And once I've done that, and I have the position of the health bar, I can now go into our code, find these canvas slots, and change them both to all of these new values that I just created. So the anchors are going to be 0.5 and 0. So I'll go ahead and change all of the anchors here. Because these two values are all going to be the same, I'm just going to do one and then copy them into the other. The next thing we have to do is the offsets. So I'll go back to here. Our offsets are 0, 150, we'll say this is 1480. So let's go to the code and change this to 0, 150, 1480. Then our alignment is 0.5, 0.5. So we will go and change that as well. And we'll leave everything else the same. So now I'll copy these three here and paste them on our second canvas slot as well, because they're going to be identical. If you want to know how this health bar works, you should go watch the other video on it. So now that we have the health bar looking like how we want, we need to make it function like how we want. And that means we need a boss health. And that means we need to make it use the boss's health rather than the player's health. So we'll go ahead and first remove the shield here. Again, this is just some stuff I forgot to remove previously. So I'll remove all of this like so. And we then need to go ahead and actually create our boss's health. So I'll go up here underneath our boss manager and I'll create a variable that I'll call boss health. And you can make this an editable if you like, but I'm just going to define it in the code. I'll make it a float and I'll say our boss's health is, let's say 5,000. Now I'm going to take this and basically just replace the custom health here with our boss health instead. And I'm also going to replace it down here where we get the player's health. And another thing we need to do is actually replace this 386, which was the right value beforehand, but that is now 1400. So we'll go ahead and set that here. And the player's health was also 100 before, but we now know that that is going to be 5,000, which is the total. So now there's one more thing we need to do with this health bar, and that is remove it from the player whenever the boss is either defeated or all the players are defeated. So to do that, we're actually going to create a custom event. So I'll scroll up here and I'm going to call this our boss fight ended event. And it'll be of type event. And we initialize it with an event just like this. And this is not correct because I need to make sure that this is all lowercase. So just like that, we now have this event, which will be able to signal and also track whenever it is signaled. So what that means is we can go down here to our health and we'll make a new block with its own loop. And we can make another block inside of this race where we wait for this event to signal. And whenever it does, we'll make sure to return to end the race. But before that, we want to completely remove this canvas from the player's UI. So we'll write if our player is equal to player agent. So we're converting our agent to a player type. And we're doing that so that we can get the player UI. And we do that by writing get player UI. And we do it for our player like so. Then we can do player UI dot remove widget and remove our canvas that we have. So whenever we signal this boss fight ended event that we just created, then it will quit everything else. So it'll stop all of these other loops and remove the health bar from the player's UI. One more quick thing I want to do is because we're dealing with a very large amount of health, we don't want to decrease and increase these by just 1.0. We're going to want to calculate a new amount based off of the difference. So go under here and write our health difference is equal to the custom health minus the boss health. And then we want to go ahead and just divide that by 30. Then instead of subtracting by 1.0, we will subtract it by the health difference. And then I'll go ahead and pretty much do the same thing here. Instead, we're going to switch the boss health and the custom health. What we now need is a way for the boss to actually be damaged. So to do that, we'll just use a prop manipulator device. So I'll make an editable, call this our prop manipulator, and it'll be of type prop manipulator device. Like so, and we'll just initialize it with another. And now with this, we'll go under on begin and write prop manipulator dot damaged event dot subscribe damage boss. Now we'll actually make this function called damage boss. The damage event will send an agent like so, and then set the boss health minus equal to whatever amount of damage we want the players to be able to do. So I'll say 50. If you want to have this different for player or weapon, you'll need your own custom damage mechanic to be able to do that. But for now, I'm going to make all damage done to the boss do 50. But we also need a way for the boss fight to be able to end, because currently it's not going to end if the boss's health hits 0 or if all the players die. So whenever the boss fight starts, we're going to go ahead and spawn a new function. So I'll write spawn, and I'm going to call this our track boss fight, like so. And now I'm going to go down here and create that. So I'll call this our track boss fight. Make sure it's suspense because we're going to have a loop in it, which is the same reason why we spawned it earlier. And I'm going to return nothing. And then inside of this, I'll go ahead and start off by creating our loop where we'll sleep for 0 seconds. One quick change I'm going to make is I'm actually going to change this players in fight, and I'm going to move it up here to the top so that I can use it in all of the other functions. And what we'll do is we'll check if players in fight dot length is less than or equal to 0. So if there's no more players left in the fight, then we will signal this boss fight ended event dot signal, and we'll also break the loop. Also, make sure you don't forget the parentheses there. There is one issue with this though, and that is whenever the players get eliminated, they're not being removed from this players in fight. So we also need to do that. I'm going to go up here where all of the players are already went through to become initiated for the health UI. And I'm going to go ahead and spawn a track players elimination function. And I'm going to send it our player. So now let's go down here and create that. So I'll write track players elimination. It's going to take in a player like so. It's going to suspend, and it's going to return nothing. And inside of this, we're going to first get the for character of our player because we need to track whether or not this or when this player is eliminated. So we'll write our for character is equal to player.get fort character like so. And now this allows us to do for character dot eliminated event dot await. So what this will do is now wait for that player to die, and whenever they do, then we want to remove them from this players in fight array. So we'll write if new array is equal to players in fight dot remove first element player. So what this does is creates a new array that is equal to our existing array that has all the players in it, except for our player who is eliminated is removed from it. Then all we need to do is set our players in fight equal to this new array that we just created that doesn't have the eliminated player in it. So now this players in fight is actually going to be updating correctly for when players are eliminated, and the boss fight will now end whenever all of the players are eliminated. But what if the boss is eliminated? Well, to do that, what we'll do is actually create a race, and we'll move this entire loop into it and put this loop under a block so that it runs independently from the other things we add to the race. And then we'll do the same thing. So we'll make another block, loop, sleep 0.0 and set, but here we will check if the boss's health is less than or equal to 0.0. And if it is, then we'll do the same thing. We will signal the boss fight end event, and we will break this loop, which will then end this race. So these two will effectively track when the boss fight is going to end. But how do we know which one ended it? Well, what we can actually do is say, did players win? And we'll set that equal to the race. Then we can go down here, and after this loop is broken, then we can return false because the players did not win. And down here after the loop, we will return true because the boss fight did eliminate it. And now that we have this, we can go under here and write if did players win, and now do different logic depending if they won or if they lost. So let's say here you could add an item grantor or something along those lines that grants them gold. Maybe display a HUD message that says you won, and under here you can display a HUD message that says you lost. But for now, I'm just going to add a print win and then print lose, like so. But after this, we also want this boss to reset so the players can fight it again. So to do this, I'm going to call a function called reset boss, like so. And then I'm going to go ahead and create this function down here and make sure it suspends and doesn't need to return anything. In this, I'm going to write a block for now, and that's because before we reset the boss, I'm just going to go ahead and have it sleep for, let's say, 10 seconds so the players have some time in the arena. But if the players are going to have some time in the arena, then we also want to hide the boss after the boss is defeated. So in order to do this, we actually need control over the boss's prop. So I'll go up here and make it editable called boss prop of type creative prop, like so. This will allow us to actually control this prop. And to be able to properly reset the boss, we're also going to need a variable called boss initial position. And this is going to be a vector 3, like so. And what we'll do is at the very start, we'll just go ahead and initialize this. So we'll say set the boss initial position equal to our boss prop dot get transform dot translation. So this just pretty much allows us to set our boss where we want it to spawn, and then it'll save that position for us so that we can then use it down here. So the first case where we're going to actually use this is as soon as the boss is eliminated, which will be right here, we're going to teleport this boss far down into the ground so that players can no longer see the boss. So I will write if boss prop dot teleport to, and we'll teleport it to the boss's initial position minus vector 3, where the z is equal to, let's say, 5,000. And then I'll just go ahead and say boss prop dot get transform dot rotation for the rotation. Put some squirrely brackets at the end to close off the if statement. And the boss will now be teleported 5,000 meters below its initial position as soon as it's eliminated where the boss ends. To be really specific, we actually only need to do that if the players win, since the boss didn't die. But the second way we're going to use this is if we go under here in reset boss, I'll paste the same thing as before, except here we don't need to add the minus because instead we'll just teleport it directly back to its initial position. But there's some other things we need to do whenever this boss resets. Set the boss's health back equal to 5,000 so that the boss's health is reset. And then we need to reset our players in fight. So I'll say set players in fight equal to an empty array. And then lastly, we need to restart the boss's timer. So I'll just copy that, go down here and write boss timer.start. And with that, we now actually have a pretty simple boss fight loop. And the boss doesn't do any attacks yet. But before we add that, let's go ahead and test this out on UEFN. Make sure to hit verse, build verse code. And now we'll have this boss manager, which we can use and drag into the play space. First thing we have is a timer device, which I'll drag next to it. I'm just going to set this duration to 10 seconds so I don't have to wait too long. Make sure that you set the completion behavior to reset. And I'll just change the timer running text to boss fight in, like so. Then I'll go back into my device and select it. Next up is our mutator zone. So I'll drag our mutator zone and place it over here. I'm going to increase the width and the depth and the height by quite a lot. Then go ahead and position it over here. And I'm also going to move our boss over here. I'm going to have this visible during game, but you'll just want to place this mutator around where players need to be in order to enter in the boss fight. I don't think anything else is required in the settings, so I'll go ahead and select that mutator zone. Next up is our prop manipulator device, which is going to be kind of the same as the mutator zone. I'm going to go ahead and place it kind of in the center of my arena. Then scroll down here to advanced and turn on affect all objects in a zone. Then go ahead and make it about the same size as your arena. So anywhere that your boss can go, you also want this prop manipulator to cover that area. Once you've done that, you can go ahead and select that. Then lastly, we just have our boss prop, which we can go ahead and select. And then I'm going to do one more thing before I launch session, and that is get both an item granter that's going to give me a weapon I can actually use against the boss. So I'll just get a rapid fire SMG, set this to all, and grunt on game start. And then also a damage volume that'll allow me to eliminate myself. So I'll just set this to elimination and put it over here in the arena. Also make sure it's visible in game. Now I'm going to launch session to test it out. Alright, so now in game, the timer automatically starts, and as long as I'm inside of this zone, then whenever the timer runs out, the boss fight's going to start, and as I hit the enemy, you can see the boss bar is going to decrease, and if we defeat the boss, then it will say win, and then after a couple seconds, the boss fight will respawn and the timer starts again. If I'm outside of the zone, then it'll print lose because there is no players that are in the fight. And again, it'll wait a couple seconds and then start the timer again. So after the boss fight starts, I'm going to go over here and eliminate myself. You'll see it prints lose, and if we give it a couple seconds, then the boss fight should start again. Yep, the timer starts, and as long as we're in it, then we can fight the boss again. Before we move on to attacks though, I do want to make one little improvement to this health because I realized that I had made a mistake here. Instead, what we're just going to do is remove this entire section and just replace this custom health with the boss health, which we can go ahead and remove this as well. And this will just make, but we don't just want to fix the health bar, we also want to go ahead and add some texts so that one, we can display a name for the boss, and two, we can display the actual health amount rather than just having a bar. So let's go ahead and do that. Up here where we create our different widgets, we'll create two text blocks, one for the health text and of type text block, like so. Here we're getting an error, and that's because we need to include Fortnite.com/using UI. So I'll just copy that up here. And then inside of this, I'll go ahead and make the default justification equal to text justification.center. Then I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this, and I'll call it the name text, and the text justification will say the same. Now if we go back into UEFN and open up our widget blueprint, we can go ahead and figure out where we're going to place these texts. So I'll add it here, change the anchors and alignment. I want my text to appear here above the boss UI. And then I'm going to duplicate this and place it on the health bar to display the actual text. So now that I know where these are going to be, I can go ahead and minimize this and then add both of these into our verse file. So I'll copy this canvas slot here, like so. I'll change the widget to my new widget called health text. And now if we go back, we just need to copy all of these values. Our X is going to be 0, our Y for the health, which is the one we're doing, should be the exact same as what our stack box is going to be for the health. So I'll keep that as 150, but then the size is 165 and 40. So I'll change the right to 165 and the bottom to 40. Now I'm going to go ahead and duplicate this again, except for I'm going to change the widget to the name text, and the only value I should need to change here is going to be the top value. So in this case, instead of 150, it's going to be 75. So I'll go ahead and change that. But we also need to actually set these texts. So I will say name text dot set text, and here we need to add what we want. So I'll say Gobla the golem, and we're gonna get an error, and that's because this needs to be a message. So we need to make a string to message function. To do that, we're gonna go up here and write message and press tab. This will automatically create a function, but because I'm using this verse language snippets extension, I recommend using it. If not, you just go ahead and copy this word for word. But now I can go ahead and use that and just call it here inside of my function and put the name inside of this string to message function. So now this will be converted to a message and the text can be properly set to it. The next thing I need to do is actually the health text. So I'll go down here where the health bar is being updated, and I'll say the health text dot set text, the same as before, except here we do have an issue, and that's because we don't even have the health text. So we'll just go ahead and make sure we take it by writing health text of type text block, and then whenever we call this function, we'll send it from this function here. So I'll just write comma health text. So now that we have access to this, we are just going to go ahead and copy this section here like so, except instead of this, we need to actually represent the health. So I will get rid of this and write boss health, then a slash, and then the 5,000 like so. There is one issue with this, and that is because boss health is a float, this is going to show as, 312.00000, which we don't want. So I'm actually going to go ahead and remove that and instead convert it to an integer. So I'll write if boss health int is equal to int boss health, then I will instead add the boss health int here and then make sure it's underneath the if statement so that we can actually use it. Now that we have both of these text blocks added and they're being updated appropriately, we can now actually focus on making attacks. So I'm going to go and minimize all of this health stuff that we no longer need. So I'll go ahead and minimize all of this like so. And what we now need is to make a new function. So I'll go down here and write spawn boss fight attacks like so, and then I'll create that function and make sure it suspends because we want to constantly loop different attacks. So that's going to be the first thing we do. We'll make a loop and I'll go ahead and sleep for 0 seconds. Before we start adding things, I am going to go ahead and actually make this a race because we want these attacks to stop whenever the boss is eliminated. So I'll go under here and make a block where we'll say boss fight ended event dot await like so. And then this loop, I'll also make sure it's in a block. So now whatever we put under this loop is also going to end whenever the boss fight ends. So inside of this, we want to make sure that we have random attacks every time. So to do that, I'll say random attack is equal to get random int from 0 to however many attacks you have. If there's 2 attacks, you'd put 1. If you have 3 attacks, you'd put 2, and so on. Then we'll just put an if statement. So we'll say if the random attack is equal to 0, then we'll do whatever random attack 0 is, or the first attack is. Then else if random attack is equal to 1, we'll do the next attack. Else if random attack is equal to 2, we'll do a different attack. This will now make it so that we have a random attack every single time. But how do you actually make each attack? Well, to do that, what I recommend is the easiest way is to actually use a bit of verse and combine that with the use of cinematics. But even then, there's a lot of different variety when it comes to attacks, and the process for each different type of attack is definitely going to vary a lot. So The best I can do is explain to you how to make 3 different types of attacks, and then you should be able to use that process to make your own custom attacks. So the 3 attacks I'm going to make are going to be one where the boss runs at the closest player and tries to attack them whenever they get close. 2, I'm going to make a summon attack that attacks every single player. And 3, I'm going to make a more simple attack that affects the entire arena. So let's go ahead and get started with the first, which is running and attacking the closest player whenever they get in range. So to do that, there's 2 big things we need to do. We need to make the boss look at and then move towards the player. And to do this, there's a couple things we need to do. First, we need to find a way to get the closest player. And to save a little bit of time when doing this, I'm going to use a function that I've already created and also included in past tutorials. And this will just find the nearest player from a prop. So I'm going to go ahead and paste it down here. How it works is it has a very high number, then it goes through all of the players. And if the distance from the prop and that player is less than the current nearest location, then it replaces the target with that. And because it goes through every single player and checks the distance, it'll always return the closest player. The only thing I actually need to change here is from this alive players, we need to throw in the players in fight. And also go ahead and remove this like so, and then just replace that. If you're following along, you can go ahead and just copy this word for word. Or if you want, this file is going to be for free in our Discord, which will include all these functions in it. So now we can go ahead and use that. We'll say if our target is equal to find nearest target prop, and the prop we'll send it is our boss prop. So I'll write boss prop in here. And this function does have decide, so we are going to need brackets. Then make sure to close off the if statement. So now that we have our target, we now need to make the boss face and move towards that target. So to face the target, we need to get the rotation from where our boss is to the location of our target. And to do that, I'm going to steal another function that I've already created and paste it down here. So now that we have this, we can go ahead and get that rotation. So we'll say the rotation to look is equal to get rotation to location. And then we need 2 positions. So we'll go ahead and get our boss position, which is equal to the boss prop dot get transform dot translation, as well as the target position, which is equal to our target dot get transform dot translation. So the rotated location is going to be the boss's position, and the location to rotate to is going to be the target position. So now that we have the rotation for the prop to look at, we also need to go ahead and get the speed of the prop. So I'll say our speed is equal to, and here, because we want our boss to move at a constant speed, we need to get the time it'll take for the boss to actually move. So I'll say our time is equal to, and to be able to get the time, we need to use the formula for speed, which is distance over time, which in this case will change to being the distance divided by the speed. So we first need to get our distance. And so I'll write distance to target is equal to the distance between our boss position and our target position. So now that we have this distance, our time is going to be our distance divided by the speed, which in this case, you can write whatever you want. I think a good speed for this type of boss is going to be 700. So now all we need to do is actually move the boss. So I'll write boss prop dot move to target position, comma, rotation to look, and then our time. There is one issue with this. Let's say the boss is very far away from the player. So that means it's going to take 3 seconds for the boss to move from one side of the arena to the player. This is going to move the boss from that one position to the player's position over that 3 seconds, but it's also going to move the rotation over that 3 seconds. That means instead of the boss instantly facing the player and then moving towards them, the boss is instead going to slowly rotate as they're moving, which is not what we want. It's going to look very bad. So how do we fix this? Well, to do that, we basically need to split the move to up into smaller sections. That way, every move to, the boss can rotate faster and actually face the player. So we can leave the rotation the same, but we do need to split the position it's moving to into fragments, as well as the time into fragments. So how do you split up the position? Well, instead of moving directly from the boss to the target, we're basically going to make a line from the boss to the target and then cut up that line. So to make a line that is facing the target, we'll say if our line facing target is equal to the target position minus the prop position. This will get the difference, and then we're going to make this a unit vector. And what making a unit vector does, oh, here also we need to go and make sure we put this in parentheses. And instead of prop position here, we're going to write boss position. So what making a unit vector does is instead of a full line, it's a very, very small line from the boss facing the target. So now if we multiply that line by a certain amount, it'll extend that line towards the target. So we'll say our new position is equal to our line facing target. And we just need to multiply it by however long we want that line to be. And in order to split up the line, we'll take the distance to target and we'll divide that by however many sections we're going to split it up into. And I'm going to just split it up into 5. Also, I'm going to make sure that this is in parentheses. But this is just an extended line. We don't necessarily know where this line is. It's just a line. So we need to actually add this to the boss's position so that it starts from the boss's position and points toward the target. So I'll just write our boss position plus all of this. But because we're dividing the amount it's moving by 5, we also need to divide the time by 5 so that it actually lines up accordingly. And now we can just replace this target position with the new position and make sure we press tab here so that we can actually use it. And just like that, the boss is now actually going to move towards the player. But the boss isn't actually going to be playing any animations yet. So we need to go ahead and do that. I'll go up here, and for this fight specifically, we're going to need 2 different animations, which means we'll need 2 different cinematics. I'll make an editable, and I'll call this our run cinematic of type cinematic sequence device, and we'll just initialize it with itself. And then I'll copy this and make another one that I'll call stomp cinematic, like so. So what we need to do is go down here and write at the start of this random attack, run cinematic dot play. So it'll play this run cinematic. So now that the boss will actually play a run animation, we need to figure out the logic for once the boss actually moves to the player's location. So whenever a move is finished, we will check if we need to get the distance again. So I'll say our new distance to target, and then we'll just check if this new distance to target is less than whatever you want the attack range to be. So I'll say like 500, for example. Then I'm going to go ahead and play the stomp cinematic like so. And while this is playing, I also need to pause this function. So I'll add a sleep, and in here I'll write whatever the duration of the stomp cinematic is going to be. And right now I'm just going to guess and say 2. We might need to come back and change that later. But we also need to pause the run cinematic before this happens. So I'll copy this and instead pause it because we don't want them running and stomping at the same time. And just like that, that's the verse done for our very first attack. So now we can go ahead and move on to making the cinematics for it. I'll go into UEFN and go into my boss stuff. And actually, I'm going to create a new folder, and I'm going to call this our boss attacks. Then open this up and create a new cinematic level sequence. And this one I'll just call our run sequence. Then open it up. This will be the easiest. You want to grab your golem prop, drag it in, add an animation, and add your running or walking animation. Then make sure to end the sequence at the end of this running animation and put a keyframe at the start and a keyframe at the end. So it'll just walk for 2 seconds. But you want to make sure that your animations are looping, especially the walking animation, and that they're not actually physically moving the boss. Instead, the boss is still standing still and kind of walking in place. But that's all we actually need for this one. I'm going to go ahead and save and then create a cinematic device for this. So I'm going to all make a cinematic sequence like so and select the new sequence I just made. I'll call this our boss run sin. In this, visibility should be set to everybody, and loop playback should be turned on because we want this to continue playing over and over again. And then we can just go ahead and select this. We're not going to have our new options yet because we haven't built verse code, so let's go ahead and do that. And now we have both of our cinematics, so I'll select the run sin. Now we get into the more complicated sequence, and that's going to be our stomp sin. So I'll go back into fight stuff, and I will create another cinematic and level sequence, and I'm going to call this our stomp sequence. Open it up. Same thing applies. We do want to go ahead and add our golem, and here we will add our animation and select what we want, which in this case is just going to be this stomp animation that I have. So as you can see, it is 1.5 seconds long. If you actually feel like your animations are too fast or too slow, which this is a little fast for my liking, so I'm actually going to go ahead and right click on the animation, go to edit section, and you can just change the play rate right here. So let's say like 0.8. Now the cinematic is at 1.5. It is 1.9 seconds long, which I don't like. I'm going to make it a little bit slower so that it gets to that 2.7 mark, so maybe 0.76. Yep, perfectly. Now that is at exactly 2 seconds. So if I play it, it stomps and it's a little slower. Same thing as before, you do want to end this cinematic at the end of your animation. And this is now playing. The next thing that we're going to add to this is going to be our damage, how we actually are going to damage the player. So to do this, I'm going to go ahead and get a damage volume, and you want to go and place it down over to the side. You don't want it in your arena. In this, you can select whatever damage you want. I'm going to make it visible for the time being, just for testing purposes, but you'll probably want this invisible in game. So I'm going to go ahead and make this a cylinder, and I'll rename this to our stomp damage. And then I'm going to drag this and place it underneath my golem blueprint so that it is now attached to it. What that means is whenever I move this golem, it's also going to move this stomp damage. The other thing I can do is actually now go and place it directly inside of my golem where I want the damage zone to be. So I'll place it right here, and I think it's a little too big, so I'm going to change the size and width a little bit like so. Let's say that's what I want my damage zone to be. But we need to make sure that this lines up where the attack is. So I'll go and check my sequence, and as you can see, it's now a little offset. So I actually want this to be right here. So now that we have this lined up, we also want to go ahead and go into our damage volume and make sure it's enabled on phase none so that it starts disabled. And then we want to add this to our sequence. So if we go to the start of the sequence, we'll add a track, and we're going to add gameplay events. Then we're going to add a keyframe here. And if you select this keyframe and right click and then go to properties, we can select the function of this damage manager that we're actually going to control. Disable, so we just double check that it's disabled. It should start disabled. We don't necessarily need to do this, but it's nice to do it just to be safe. But whenever the boss does stomp, right as it actually goes and attacks at 0.93 seconds, I'll add another gameplay event, right click, go to properties, enable. Then let's say like 1 second later or 1 frame later, I'm going to add another frame. You might have to zoom in a little bit to be able to actually edit it, and I will disable it again. So now what'll happen is as this plays, boom, right at the second of stomping, this damage volume is going to enable just for 1 tick and damage any players that are inside of it. So now that our damage is set up, you can now go ahead and add anything else you want to this sequence. So let's say you have a cool Niagara effect that you want to include. You can add the effect straight into the sequence, add a lifetime component, and make it activate at this location at the exact moment that it stomps. Or maybe you add a camera shake so that it shakes the camera. There's a lot of different things you can do with the sequencer, and it's very powerful. So if you don't know how to do any of that stuff and you want to learn how, I would recommend searching for it, as there's tons of really great tutorials out there. But with that, we now have our first attack pretty much fully made. So I'll go ahead and close out of the sequencer. And now I can go over here and I'm going to duplicate our existing cinematic, select our stomp sequence. Here we don't want this to loop, so I'll disable that. And we'll keep visibility to everyone. Now I'm going to go ahead and rename this to our stomp sin really quickly. And then finally select it in our device. And with that, our first attack is pretty much done. There's actually one more thing that I do want to change. If we go back into verse, our distance to target, we don't want it to go the entire distance. We'll subtract this by, let's say, 300. So now instead of moving to be inside of the player, it's going to stop a little bit before. And also, we want our boss's Z position to always be the same. So instead of moving it to our new position here, we're actually going to make a vector 3 where the x is equal to the new position.x, our y is equal to the new position.y, but our z value is equal to whatever the z value is in your map. So let's say here, our z value is just going to be 0. So we'll just go ahead and select that like so. The reason we do this is if we didn't add this, whenever the target jumps, the boss is going to start moving up to go towards the player, which is not what we want at all. We want it to stay flat. And as a heads up, if you do have an arena that is going to be changing height areas, then this will not work. All right, and with that, that should be our very first attack complete. So let's go ahead and actually test this out. I'll build verse code and launch session. All right, so now in game, if we go ahead and get inside of our arena, whenever the boss fight starts, it'll now actually chase and face the player. And if it gets in distance, it will attack the player like so. And if we actually hit the boss, it'll also lose its health. So that's our first attack done. We can now go ahead and move on to our next attack. So we'll move on to our random attack 1, which is going to attack all players. So we will write for every single player in our players in fight, like so. We'll also need to go ahead and get the for character for each. So I'll write FC is equal to player.get for character. This way we can get their position. And for each player, we're going to need 2 things, and that's going to be their own cinematic and their own damage volume. So I will say editable player cinematics, and it'll be an array of cinematic sequence device, which is just equal to an array. And then we'll also need player damages, which is an array of damage volume device, like so. And then we also need one more cinematic, which I'll just go ahead and copy this, and I'll call this our summon cinematic so that we can just play an animation for our boss. So I'll now go down here, and first we'll just go to call our summon cinematic dot play like so. We also need to go ahead and make sure our run cinematic is stopped because that will be looping. And we basically need to get a different cinematic. And what we need to do is get a different cinematic and a different damager for each player. So we need to get the index of whatever player we are currently looking at. And I'll write if our player's damager is equal to player damages index, and then the exact same thing except for our player's sin, and it'll be equal to our player cinematics index. With this, we're going to get a different cinematic and a different damage volume for each player. And we can now say player's damager dot teleport to. We need to go ahead and include this in an if statement because it's a teleport. So I'll just write that. And then where we'll teleport it to is the fc dot get transform. And I'm going to change that to swirly brackets. And then we're going to say players sin dot play. The other thing I am going to do before we go ahead and create the cinematics is I'll go up here and write sleep for 1.0 or 1.5 actually. And that'll give enough time for the summon cinematic to actually play before activating the attack for all the different players. So now let's go ahead and make these cinematics. Go ahead and minimize that and head into our boss attacks and create a new cinematic. And I'll call this our summon cinematic, or our summon sequence, I mean. Open this up, add our boss's prop, like so, add an animation, and I'm going to add our summon animation, which is just a simple roar in my case. I'll go ahead and shrink that. It looks like the time of this is 1.3. So I'll actually go back into our verse and change this sleep 1.5 to sleep 1.3 so that it lines up. Or I could have actually slowed the animation down, but it's not that big of a deal with this cinematic. That's all we need for our summon sin. Obviously, here again, you can add different effects like camera shake and even audios. One thing that you should be careful with audios is you need to make sure that you add an attenuation to them, because if you don't, then having it in a sequencer and having that sequencer set to everyone will make everyone in the entire game hear the sounds that you're playing rather than just the players that are close to the boss. But this is all I need to do for now, so I'll just go ahead and save. And I now need to make our different players sequences. So I'm going to copy this, and I'll call this our player sequence 1. Then open this up. We don't actually need the golem BP in this cinematic, so I'll go ahead and remove it. Instead, we need to go ahead and actually first add our damage volumes. So I'm actually just going to go ahead and copy this damage volume and make sure it's not attached to your golem blueprint, because that's not what you want here. And I'm going to make a couple of them, but before I do that, I'll rename this to player damager 1. And I'm going to go ahead and make 3, because we're going to want to make as many cinematics and as many damage volumes as there are players that can possibly be in the boss fight. So let's say you have 16 different players that can all fight the boss at the same time. You're going to need 16 different damage volumes and 16 different sequences for player-based attacks. But now what I can do is go into the sequencer, select my first player damager, go into here, and in this, I'm just going to have a rock fall from the sky and land on the players. So I'll just go ahead and grab a stone prop from a Fortnite gallery, maybe a rock. I think that might be better to search for. Yep. Here we go. We have maybe something like this right here. So I'm going to have this fall on the different players. So I'll call this R rock 1. Now go back into our sequencer, and actually before we even add it to our sequencer, I'm going to first delete this because it automatically added, and instead attach it to our player damager 1 because we want this to move with the damager. And then I'm going to position this up here above the damager. Now I'll add the rock and say, and add a transform. Make sure in this transform, I'm going to actually click this add section and click additive. Because if not, this will use the world position and not work properly and it won't actually play the animation based off its current position. It'll play the animation based off of wherever it is inside of this sequence, which will be over here and not wherever the player is. Okay, so for the first keyframe, I'm going to have it start super small. I'll add an element here. Then at 1 second, I'm going to have it be much larger at about 1. Add another keyframe. And then at the end, I'm going to have it drop down right to the ground and then add my third keyframe. So if we go ahead and play this, it will start, grow, and then drop. And I'm actually going to extend this by a little bit, and that's because we want to activate our damager. So I'll add a gameplay event. At the very start, I will make sure that it is disabled by right-clicking here, properties, disable. Then right where the rock falls, I am going to add another event where I enable the damage volume, and then just 1 tick later, I am going to disable it again by disabling it with a keyframe. And then I'm going to let the rock sit there for a little bit before it gets reset. So I'll extend the cinematic by a little bit more. Now I'll save the sequencer and duplicate the sequencer, open it up, and actually before I do that, I'm going to close the sequencer. I'm going to select this rock and duplicate it 2 more times. Select the rock 2, attach it to damager 2, rock 3, damager 3, and space out a little bit. Now I can open up the sequence 2. First, I'm going to select this new rock 2, and then I'm going to right click this rock, assign actor, replace with selected. And that'll just replace the selected and keep all of the keyframes the same so that we don't have to redo it. Now I'll do the same thing. I'll select our second damager, right click, assign actor, replace with selected. Save the sequencer, duplicate the sequence for the 3rd time, open it up, and then select rock 3, right click, assign actor, replace with selected, gameplay or player damager, click on the 3rd, then right click this and go assign actor, replace with selected. Then I go ahead and save this, but before I'm going to make sure this all works, which it looks like it does. And we now have our 3 cinematics set up. So all we need to do is hit verse, build verse code, then go ahead and create all of our actual cinematic devices. So I'll just duplicate this, call this our boss summon sin. Make sure this is set to everybody, and I'll select our summon sequence. Then I will duplicate this again, call this our player sin 1, and then select our player sequence 1. Then do this 2 more times, except change the player sequence in all of them. Now I can open up my boss device, select our summon cinematic, then add all 3 of our player cinematics along with all 3 of our damage volumes. Make sure that you're selecting them in order so that they all align. For example, the first index is the cinematic 1, which uses the player damager 1. If not, there's going to be some issues. Before we actually test this in game, we first also want to go ahead and sleep for 1.5 seconds so that there's enough time for this attack to complete before it starts a new attack. Also, because we split this up into different sections, whenever this attack plays, or a running attack, it'll only play 1 section before moving to the next, which means we actually need to play this multiple times. So let's say whenever this attack plays, we'll say for every single attack loop from 0 to, let's just make it play 10 times, which would be 9 because it's starting at 0, and make sure to put an equal sign here. Then we'll put everything underneath that, which means this will actually activate 9 times. So now with these 2 changes, we can go ahead and build verse code and then push changes. All right, so now in game, if I go ahead and wait for the boss to start, You can see the boss will come and try to attack, and every once in a while it'll do this summon where it summons at the player's location. And if I go ahead and let it fall, it will damage me. There's one issue though, is that it does reset automatically at the player's location, which we don't want. We actually want to go ahead and teleport this away. So I'll go ahead and do that quickly. If we go back into the code, whenever this finishes, we'll go through every single damage in player damages and say if damage dot teleport to, and then we're just going to teleport this away to some vector 3 where the x will just put a really far away number. Let's say the x, y, and z are all going to be 10,000. For z, I'll do negative 10,000 so that it's under the map. And then we also just need to include a rotation. And then I'll close off the if statement. And this will just teleport the damager away after the attack is finished. Also, you might run into some issues if you're using this sort of summon attack because there is collision. So just make sure that for the prop you use, instead of using a Fortnite prop, use a custom prop where you can actually turn off the collision. All right, that's it for these two attacks. Now we go and move on to the actual easiest version of the attacks, and that is an arena specific attack. So what that means is instead of attacking a specific player or doing any sort of first knowledge, we're just going to make a cinematic that will play and affect the entire arena and actually have a global position. So I'll call this our arena attack. This is going to be the easiest to set up because we don't really need to do much reverse or anything for it. It's just all going to be inside of the cinematic. So I'll actually go ahead and copy this damager. I'll call this our arena damager, for example. And these, I'm going to make sure they are placed outside of the arena because I'll actually want to keep them on. And for this attack, I'm just going to have this damage volume just sweep the entire arena so the players have to jump over it. To be able to jump over it, it needs to be a lot smaller than this. So I will make the width and depth 0.2, maybe actually 0.1. Then I will move it down, which I'm pretty sure players will be able to jump over it. The height, I'm going to make a lot larger. So I'll say the height is 5. And this, we're just going to make sure this is always enabled instead of starting disabled. And then I can just go ahead and add this arena damager. I'll add a transform. We don't need to make it additive or anything like that. And for the very first keyframe, I'm going to go over here. And it looks like the length isn't enough, so I'll actually make it 7. Go ahead and position it where I want. Add a keyframe. And then go for however long I want the attack to be. So let's say 3 seconds and make it move over here. So I'll go ahead and add the next transform. I'm actually going to add a couple more of these. So I'm going to save this, close out the sequencer for now, and make, let's say we just make 5 of these actually. And then I'll go back into our sequence and add all of the other ones I just made. And we'll go ahead and position all of these like so that they are in the same position as the other one, except they are evenly spread out. I'll go ahead and make sure there is some space between each so the players can jump over them. And then I'll select them all again, add a transform, and add a keyframe so that they all start here. You might have to go and keyframe each one. And then, just like the first one, I am going to go to the 3-second mark and move all of them towards where I want them to be. I'm also going to actually select this one because I want to change the keyframe for it so that they actually end like so. I think actually if you go ahead and select all of the transforms as well, except for the first one, and then if I move them all to where I want them to be and press enter, it's going to keyframe all of them. Yep. So whenever this starts, it moves like so. However, that looks a little too fast for players, so I'm going to select all of these keyframes and move them out so this is actually 5 seconds, so that this moves much slower. That still seems a little fast, so I'm going to increase the length of this by another couple seconds, let's say 8, and then move them all over here. And now it should be slow enough for players to actually jump over these. Now I'll go ahead and save this, close it out, and we have our arena attack pretty much completed. Now we just need to go ahead and do the verse really quick, which should be simple. I'll make another cinematic, so I'll just copy this. I'll call this our arena cinematic, and then whenever this starts, I will make sure the run cinematic stops. I will then play the arena cinematic, and then I will sleep for the duration of the cinematic, like so. If I want as well, I actually want to go back into the cinematic really quickly. I'll minimize all of this. Then I will throw in my boss and just add a quick animation at the start to cast another spell so that something actually happens with the boss whenever these start moving instead of the boss just standing still for no reason. Now I can go ahead and save this, create my cinematic that I need. So I'll just go ahead and copy this one, call this our boss arena sin, select our arena attack, make sure this is set to restore state because we want all of these to move out of the arena after we're done. And then finally, build verse code and select our cinematic. So with this, there's a lot of different things you can actually do arena attack wise. Like, let's say we have a bunch of different boulders that fall around the map, or even like half of the arena is a danger zone for a while. You can have lava fall. I mean, there's so many different things you can do just with cinematics alone, and it really allows you to create some pretty awesome boss fights without it taking too long or having too much complexity. Anyways though, I'm gonna go ahead and push changes to test this out. Okay, so now if we go and wait for the boss to start again, whenever the boss starts, it starts with these cinematics where these rocks are falling, and we also have the summon attack which we can dodge. It seems like it's still a little too fast, but occasionally the boss will come and try to stomp on us, and we have to kind of figure out what attack it's doing, but then we can just continue fighting the boss, and all of the attacks looks like they're working. And once we die, the boss should go ahead and wait a couple seconds and reset. And with that, you now know how to create awesome boss fights in UEFN by using cinematics and verse. If you found this tutorial helpful and you want to support us in creating more awesome tutorials just like this one, then like and subscribe and comment any tutorials that you want to see us make next. Also, don't forget to check out Map Academy in the description below. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.